Hi friends. What I'd like to do today is take you back to a duck hunt in the fall of 1910. Well, it was supposedly a duck hunt, but not really. What I mean to say is in the fall of 1910 in Jekyll Island, Georgia, right off the coast, there was believed to be a meeting of some of the most powerful minds and private banking in the country, led by the head of the Finance Committee in the Senate, Senator Nelson Aldrich. Now, last time we were together, we talked about the national debt. And you cannot talk about the national debt without talking about the Federal Reserve and the overall banking system that this country is principled on. And so fast forward a couple of years, about 3 years later, December of 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed into law the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, creating and empowering what we now know as the Federal Reserve banking system. So the structure is complex, but also fairly straightforward. There are three basic parts of the Federal Reserve as we know it. The first is that the Federal Reserve has 12 regional banks, geographically positioned all around the country. It also has what's known as the FOMC, or the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee. The third piece is the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, which is a 7-seat Board of Governors. So let's quickly unpack each of those. The 7-seat Board of Governors govern on the welfare of its member banks, which we'll discuss in just a minute. The free market operations, the FOMC arm, is the independent arm that is used to collect fees and services from private banks. Which brings us to the third arm, which is there are 12 regional federal banks in Boston, San Francisco, Dallas, and in 12 locations across the country. Each geographical Federal Reserve is an independent entity that answers to the Board of Governors, but that is responsible to the private banks in its geographical region. So every time a bank has a deposit or collects funds, it sends it to its geographical Federal Reserve Bank. So JP Morgan in New York is accountable to the New York Fed. That's where they are required to subscribe to private shares of that Federal Reserve Bank, pay fees and subscription service fees to that Federal Reserve Bank, and they're required to keep their liquid and cash reserves there as well. So the question has been posed to me just earlier today, is the Federal Reserve public or private? Well, the answer is both. It's public in a sense that the president appoints the Federal Reserve Chair and the 7-seat Board of Governors. But it's private in a sense that it is not a government entity. It is not subsidized by congressional funds. You see, the Federal Reserve derives its income from three places. Number one, from the interest it collects on treasury bills or government debt. And oh, by the way, they get that income tax-free. Now, the second place it derives its income from is the fees it charges to its banks for processing their cash and setting protection and structures in place for its private member banks. And the third place is from other assets its own. So let's get a snapshot of a very complex structure. Is that there's a large Federal Reserve which is not funded or operated by the federal government, but yet controls the entire monetary system for our country. It then has 12 sort of cousins that operate independently from this mothership Federal Reserve Board. And it is made up of private sector banks. So you can see some questions arise in how is monetary policy created? Whose interest does it serve? The federal government's interest, the private sector's business, or private corporations' interests? The Fed was mandated at its inception to conduct three basic policies: maximize employment, keep prices stable, so avoid inflation and deflation at extremes, and govern interest rates. So the Fed funds sets the interest rate of which the entire monetary system operates on. Now, this could be a 25-part video series, but here's what I want us to look at next time is knowing that basic structure and history of the Federal Reserve. What are the potential effects that the Federal Reserve recent actions during coronavirus, and what's their effects on our economy both now and over the long term? I'll see you next time.